We'll now take a look at two additional statements called the break and continue statements. These alter the flow of the control in our programs. Now, we have already seen the break statement in switch structures, and using them in loops isn't really any different. It pretty much serves two main purposes. So the first thing is to allow us to exit early from a loop. So as soon as we read the break statement, we just get out of the loop regardless of the number of iterations we've gone through it. It also allows us to skip the remainder of a switch structure. So if we read one particular part of the case and then we see our break line, then we don't need to execute any of the other cases. Now, once we've gotten out of our structure, whether it's a switch statement or whether it's a loop, whatever comes immediately after the structure would be the next thing that we run. Now, it is possible to use a break statement instead of using Boolean values in some cases. So let's take a look at a couple examples. So here's some code where we do not use a break statement. In this case, we're going to be reading values from a file, and we're going to add the values of them. So we're going to keep reading as long as we don't get a negative number. So what we're saying here is in our while loop, we check that as long as there's still something to read in the file and the value is not negative, so we use a Boolean variable to keep track of whether something's negative or not, we're going to read in a value with our value, and then we're going to check if it's less than 0, we're going to set is negative to true, which means we're done, we don't add up any more things, and otherwise we'll take our value and add it to our sum. So we're just reading one integer at a time in our file, and we just keep doing this until we're either at the end of the file or the value that we read is negative. Now let's take a look at the exact same code, except now we're using a break statement. So notice that in this case, I don't need my is negative Boolean variable anymore. So we just check as long as there's still something to read, we input the number, and if it's negative, then we just immediately get out. We just immediately include our break statement to get out of our loop because we don't need to go back. And then otherwise, if it's not true, well, we're going to skip the break statement and we're just going to take our number and add it to sum. So here we just have one break statement that takes care of getting out of the loop if we have a negative value. Whereas in our previous example, we needed to declare a Boolean variable. We needed to check to make sure that it's still false. And then whenever we get our condition to get out of the loop, we need to set it true. Now, with that said, that doesn't mean that every single case is going to allow us to use a break statement instead of Boolean variables, but this is one example where using a break statement simplifies our code a lot. So the second statement we can take a look at is called the continue statement, and this can also be used in our loops. The biggest difference between continue statements and break statements is that instead of immediately getting out of the loop, we just end the current iteration and we proceed to the next one. So what we're saying here is anything that comes immediately after the continue statement, we just skip it and we immediately go to the condition and reevaluate it. Now for loops, this just means that we run our update statement immediately after continue. So with while loops, we skip everything that's below the continue statement, we go back to our condition. For loops, we would end our iteration, we would immediately update our loop control variable and check our condition again. So let's use the exact same example from before, but instead of immediately getting out of our loop if we read a negative number, let's just skip that number. So here's our code. So everything in the beginning part stays the same. So we have our sum. As long as there's something to read, we will read in something through console.nextInt. The difference now is if num is negative, instead of using a break, we would use this continue statement. So all we're just saying here is if we read a negative number, we'll just skip what comes afterwards and we'll continue reading. So here, instead of taking our num and adding it to our sum, we just skip all that and go immediately to the beginning of our while loop and run our condition again and just pretty much keep repeating. So this just skips any negative numbers that we read. And a couple notes worth mentioning about break and continue statements. They are great ways to control loops without having to add extra variables. As we saw, we can use a break statement or a continue instead of a Boolean variable in order to decide whether to get out of a loop early or not. The problem though is if we use too many of these statements, it's going to make the loops very difficult to manage and follow. So please use them sparingly. You probably only need one or two break statements for a loop if you have certain cases where you need to get out. But try not to overbear the entire loop with adding break statements, because then it probably defeats the purpose of even using a loop. And it's worth noting that the continue statement works very differently when using it for a for loop or a while loop. So in a for loop, at the end of every iteration, we're going to run our update statement no matter what. So even if there is a continue statement and we read it and pretty much skip the remainder of that iteration, we're still going to run that update statement. With a while loop, however, the update statement is part of the body of the loop, which means it's going to come after the continue statement. So if we read that continue statement and skip the remainder of that body, then the update statement is going to get skipped. So we just have to be really careful with this when we're using a continue statement.